My name is Adam Andrzejewski. Welcome to this segment of the Ripoff of the Week. I'm the CEO and founder of OpenTheBooks.com. At OpenTheBooks.com, you know our mission. It's every dime online in real time. And to that end, last year, our auditors filed an incredible number of Freedom of Information Act requests. It was 40,000 requests that we filed on nearly every single substantial public body in the entire country. And we do this so you can follow the money, so you can hold your elected officials where you live accountable for tax and spend decisions. Today I'm flying solo. We normally have our co-host Tamara Colbert. Tamara couldn't make it today. And so we are going to discuss the very important topic of Palestinian aid. So let's just review this. What is Palestinian aid? Well, since 1950, ever since the 1948 Arab-Israeli conflict, there was about 750,000 Palestinians that were quote unquote displaced. So through the United Nations, there's a special fund account that helps fund the quote Palestinian refugees. So the United States is the biggest funder of that account. About one out of every $3 in that account since 1950 has been put in there by the American taxpayer. The total amount of aid on that now amounts to $6.3 billion. So it's a tremendous amount of United States taxpayer money. This fund through the UN has been going on for the last 71 years. So it's been going on a long time. Today, we don't help 750,000 Palestinian refugees. That number has actually grown to 5 million Palestinian refugees. So at openthebooks.com, we put up an investigation at Forbes. We took a look at the last 71 years worth of funding through the UN of the United States taxpayer. And specifically, we focused on roughly the last 5 or 6 years in terms of the decision making through the Obama years. Through the Obama years, the aid into that fund had peaked at about $400 million. It was at an all-time high. And then into the Trump years. Starting in the Trump years, President Trump made the decision to hold the funding as a negotiating tool in the Middle East. And Trump did something that no president has done in the last 71 years, and he cut funding into that UN account, $0. And they basically maintained that level for the last 3 years. When Trump instituted this policy, the critics of it, they cried that the world was going to end in the Middle East. The Palestinian spokesman actually said that American taxpayers have a quote unquote obligation to fund that UN account, to fund Palestinian refugees. That was a pretty incredible argument. The president had asked his advisors, asked his diplomats, President Trump, has anyone ever used the funding of the Palestinian refugees through that UN account as a bargaining chip in the peace process? And he was told, no, we didn't consider that. We never thought of that. We just figured that that would be disrespectful. So Trump played that card. So over the course of the 3 years, when funding was cut, stopped, the foreign aid to the Palestinian fund through the UN went to $0 roughly for that 3-year period. What happened in the Middle East? Well, it was one of the calmest periods on record. So there were rockets that were fired. You know, sometimes there was 12 rockets fired at Israel from the Gaza Strip, or there was 100 rockets fired. But there wasn't thousands of rockets fired. There was relative, and it's the Middle East, so it's all on a relative basis. There was relative calm in the Middle East for that 3-year period. When Joe Biden beat President Trump, becomes president, Biden's administration had a choice to make. It was whether to side with the Palestinian refugees, to side with the PLO, or to side with Donald Trump's foreign aid freeze. And starting in April, President Biden made the decision to side with the PLO. Now, it's kind of interesting. Even the Wall Street Journal gave impetus to President Trump to use the funding as a bargaining chip. Because here's what the Wall Street Journal said. The PLO has a policy of providing pensions to dead terrorists who they call so-called martyrs, to their families. The Wall Street Journal, one of the nation's premier newspapers, called this policy, they were very harsh on it, they called it pay for slay. And so, look, that policy is, from all accounts, is still in place. But the Biden administration made the decision to side with the PLO despite that policy still being in place. And they decided to reverse the Trump policy of the freeze. And they immediately reprogrammed $110 million that Congress had already approved for Palestinian aid. And so they provided that. And then within 3 weeks, the rockets started being fired from the Gaza Strip into Israel. And that's where you have this recent conflict in the Middle East. 4,000 rockets came from the Gaza Strip into Israel. Israel retaliated as they should to protect their country. And then the Secretary of State under Joe Biden travels to the Middle East. He meets, has a meeting with the Palestinian organizations and helps and says, not only do we have $110 million coming through the UN for Palestinian refugee aid, but we're also going to ask Congress for another $200 million on an expedited basis to help rebuild the Gaza Strip. So the big question is, the United States taxpayer, we've put $6.3 billion onto the Palestinian side. And rockets in real time are still raining on our ally in the Middle East, Israel. Trump had a successful foreign policy, in part because he used the aid as a negotiating chip in Middle East peace. And alliances were starting to form, agreements were starting to be inked, and it was a calm period. Biden reversed all of that. A conflict ensued, and now Biden is going to ask Congress to have the American taxpayer help rebuild Gaza. So the question is the Biden foreign policy is funding the Palestinian side with hundreds of millions of dollars worth of United States taxpayer aid? Is that good foreign policy? Does it contribute or detract from the peace process? The Middle East is a complicated world, and we've got a full timeline of all of this, the pros and cons of all of this, up at Forbes. Just Google Palestinian refugee aid, Trump, Biden. Our article will come right up at Forbes. Well, thank you for joining us on this week's segment of the Ripoff of the Week. Next week, I think we're going to be talking about Anthony Fauci. So join us right here next Thursday at the same time, 5:30 Eastern, 4:30 Central, for the next segment of the Ripoff of the Week. Thank you.